When we talk about exception handling in MVC applications, it's important to note that a lot of the MVC framework for .NET runs off the same libraries and engine that ASP.NET does. So most of the mechanisms you have for dealing with exceptions in ASP.NET or even .NET in general are still very much applicable to MVC. So as we go through some of this stuff, some of it is MVC specific, but some of it is going to be much more general. Probably the most common MVC specific-ish thing that we can do when we handle exceptions is the handle error attribute. It's globally registered by default, and it also corresponds with triggering the custom errors mode in web config. So this handle error attribute is something that basically is a global setting for your MVC applications that all exceptions bubble up to. Now, normally what happens is you get the ugly page with the stack trace and all that good stuff. But this same attribute will also allow us to filter specifically for certain kinds of exceptions, as well as throwing custom errors or custom error messages. Another property that can help us out is a property of the HTTP request, which is local. This will be true if the request is coming from the local host, or false if it isn't. So that's something that we might use when we are setting up our custom error pages. If the exception is local, then we may want to display a lot of elaborate debugging information. But if the request is not local, then that means this is actually in production somewhere, and we may just want to display a very user-friendly page. This, of course, leads us into the topic of custom 404 pages. Now, the 404 error is when the user types in a URL and there's nothing at that address. Now, in MVC, this is slightly different because the URLs in MVC trigger controller actions, and the controller is actually responsible for retrieving the view. So the URLs aren't going to specific files. Having said that, you can still very easily get a 404 error in an MVC application. Most commonly it happens when you put in a URL and there's no corresponding controller to it. So we may want to have custom 404 pages. This allows us to set up a custom view and a custom controller for handling 404s, and it allows us to configure a specific error and route for our 404 pages. The last thing I want to mention is handling first chance exceptions. When an application is running under a certain application domain, then the exception is revealed to that application domain before the program itself actually gets a chance to see it. So, before you get the ugly yellow page with the stack trace information and all that, if you're running your MVC application in debug mode, you won't see that page. The debugger will trap it first. In other words, it gets the first chance to see the exception. And then if you decide to continue, it'll throw the exception up to the program, and the program will respond to it. Well, in any given application domain, you can check to see if you have a first chance exception. In other words, an exception that is being trapped and handled by some other program or something else that has a first chance to see that exception. This is not MVC specific. This is something that is just in the .NET framework and has been there for quite some time. So we don't really see this as a live issue so much anymore, but on occasion you may still execute code and get an actual first chance exception, and what that means is that something else has actually dealt with the exception or has trapped the exception before your outer program got to look at it. Sometimes this happens with SQL Server. An exception will rise up there, and SQL Server will actually stop the exception as opposed to letting it bubble up to the application. So that's what we mean by that. But the important thing to keep in mind is that exceptions are something that, as much as we wish they wouldn't happen, they happen. And we need to deal with them gracefully. We need to deal with them gracefully not just from a user experience standpoint, but also from a security standpoint, because usually we don't want them seeing all that stack trace information. So These are some of the tools that are available to you in MVC4 for dealing with your exceptions. For exploring exception handling, I have a default ASP.NET MVC application here. It's simply from when you add a new MVC4 project and you choose the Internet Application Template. So it's pretty basic. You may be familiar with this homepage, standard homepage for the default template, and it's going to work okay for our purposes. So the question is, what do we want to happen when there are errors? Okay, so let's say, for example, I come over here and I, put in some weird URL. So I get a 404 here. The resource can't be found, and it's pretty standard error message here. Well, what's happened is, by default, the MVC project has registered this new handle error attribute as part of the global filter collection. So in order to have a global error handling mechanism, I don't really need to do anything special. It's in place. I just need to use it in a meaningful way. So you very rarely will need the handle error attribute actually on a controller, unless you are specifically trying to override the behavior. And even then, I might look at trying to do it in a more global and reusable way. But it is possible to come over here to the home controller and do something like this. Handle error, and then specify a specific exception type or a specific view that you want to handle that particular error for this controller. So you can override the settings that way. On rare occasions it's handy, but you probably won't need to do it that often. What you will probably need to do more often is take the global error handler and give it some things to do on the basis of the errors that it finds. So I want to come over here to web config, where I've commented out some code for custom errors. It goes in the system.web section of your web config, and you can set up a default redirect. Now here I've got it going to home index, which isn't that great. It just means every time you've got an error, it'll go back to the index. And that's typically not what we want, but just so you can see how it works when I fire this up. And let's say I generate another 404. That takes me right back home. Okay, now normally that's not what we want to do. We want to have a custom controller and a custom view. So I'm going to, and you can set this up however you want, I'm going to send them to the error controller. The default. Okay, so I'm going to come over here. I'm going to call this the error controller. I'm going to make this an empty MVC controller. Okay, and instead of having an index, I'm going to have a default. Okay, so that will actually correspond to this URL. Okay, now one of the interesting things is, by default, there is this little error view, okay, which says an error occurred while processing your request, and that's pretty much it. So you can make your own custom view. You can pretty much do anything you want to here. So what I'm going to do is come down here and make a folder. This will hold all of our error views. We'll use this one for default errors. Okay, and now in my web config, error default. Okay. So a default error was trapped. Alright, so that's not terrible, but a lot of times we want to show specific things about specific errors, and that's where this error status code comes in. So let's say for 404s, and you can have as many of these as you want. You can have for status code 500, for every error status code you can think of. I'm going to make the URL be error not found. Okay, so in my controller action, I'm going to add that. Now I need my view. Okay. So now when I pull it, it'll still go to that default page for every unhandled error, but for 404s now I come to this custom page. And you can repeat the same technique for just about every error code you can think of. You're going to set up a default and then custom ones for the errors you want to specifically handle. Now keep in mind that this is going to fire at the global level. Ideally, for exceptions that we specifically want to guard against, ones that we expect might happen from time to time, we want to use try-catch blocks and logging and all the things that we normally do to trap those errors at a lower level and deal with them in an intelligent way. But the handle error filter and setting up custom error pages like this can be a great technique for giving your user a good experience when things happen that we just don't expect.